It's our privilege to be joined by Professor Fabio Rojas, who is the Virginia L. Roberts Professor of Sociology at Indiana University. He's also the editor of Contexts, which is the official magazine of the American Sociological Association. In addition to his sociological research, Professor Rojas is an advocate for open borders. He's long spoken and written on these issues, which is why we've asked him to speak on this for this seminar. He has published books on social theory and political change, and his work has appeared in the American Journal of Sociology and the Academy of Management Journal, amongst many others. He co-founded the Open Borders Conference and has appeared on Vox, Ian Ideas, and other websites to promote free migration. The title of his lecture this afternoon is Open Borders, Beginner, Intermediate, and Expert Levels. And I'll just note that this is the first of 4 lectures that he will be providing at this seminar. So, Professor Rojas.
Thank you very much, Jason, for the very kind introduction. And at the beginning of every lecture or discussion that I lead for the IHS, for the Institute for Humane Studies, I like to express a little bit of gratitude to all the people who made this possible. I express gratitude towards everybody who's attending. Thank you for attending. I know you could be doing something else today. I'm also grateful to the staff at IHS and to the funders who make all this possible. So today's talk is called Open Borders, Beginner, Intermediate, and Expert Levels. My name is Fabio Rojas, and I teach sociology at Indiana University. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to discuss what open borders is, what the idea means. Then I'm going to talk about the critics of open borders at 3 different levels, kind of a beginner level, that's the level of maybe a Facebook chat or a Twitter chat, an intermediate level, which is a more academic, more serious level, and then the expert level is thinking about social change more proactively. And I'm going to go through common everyday arguments and more academic arguments that have been offered to support the idea that we should restrict migration. And I'm going to give you my opinions on why those arguments often don't hold a lot of water. So let's start by talking about a few definitions. What does it mean to be for open borders? My summary of the issue is this: let peaceful people travel between countries without impediment. To borrow a phrase from Bill Clinton, let's make migration safe, legal, and common. If you want to understand what that would mean in practice, open borders would mean that it's just as easy to move from Mexico to the United States as it would be to move from Indiana to Michigan. Okay, so make it very easy. There would be very few requirements, licenses, fees. You wouldn't need a passport. You wouldn't need a visa. There would be no wait list. There would be very few restrictions, maybe limited to only people with criminal records or contagious disease or something like that. So in general, if you want to move to London or you want to move to Mexico City, then you should be able to do that. Then the other side of the argument is called restrictionism. It's that it's desirable to erect serious barriers to movement and migration. So in other words, the restrictionist position is, yes, it is okay for governments to make migration more difficult, maybe to have a quota system, a passport system, a point system, or maybe just to ban migration altogether, right? You could think of these as existing on a spectrum where open borders is the most liberal approach to migration, while restrictionism is the most managed and the most constrained. Also during this talk, I might occasionally refer to something called the Keyhole Solution. And this is an idea that comes up in many policy domains, but the idea is that, say you have one very specific objection to open borders, or you have an objection to a certain policy proposal, then the other person could say, well, let me offer you one specific keyhole solution, one way to kind of bring you over to the other side to address this one particular issue and get you to agree on everything else. So within the study of migration or open borders, that would mean a policy designed to address a specific concern about migration, but to allow other forms of migration to continue. All right, so what we're going to talk about, like I said, the beginner level is about the man on the street argument. These are the kinds of arguments that, say, you might hear at the dinner table, you might hear on Twitter, on Facebook, or just hanging out with your friends. The intermediate level will be focused at a more academic or more intellectual level. Then I think the expert level is how to make open borders happen. And I think that's actually a very challenging issue. All right, so what is the beginner level open borders issue? It's that open borders arguments appeal to simple ethical intuitions. So the basic intuition of open borders is actually very simple, is that there is nothing wrong with moving to a new country. There's just nothing wrong in terms of moving from Mexico to the US or from the US to Canada or from Poland to Germany. There's no problem with that, in much the same way that we don't think it's problematic to move from New York to New Jersey. People move between political jurisdictions all the time. This is often very desirable. It's okay, right? And the basic insight here is that this is an intuition that most people already believe. Like most people say, it's okay to move between New York and New Jersey. It's okay to move between Ontario and other parts of Canada. It's okay. So people are already comfortable with a wide range of movement. But then they put up their hands and they say, well, if you cross a national border, then that's okay to restrict people, right? And once you appreciate that argument, that movement is okay, movement is completely normal, and we should let people do it, then you see it's very easy to refute or argue against these kind of everyday man on the street arguments, right? So what are some of these arguments that people offer, kind of these man on the street or kind of Twitter-based arguments? Some of these, frankly, rely on anti-foreigner bias. They're just expressions of bias. I think they're very easy to reject. For example, they'll say, like, the only reason people want to move to our country is to exploit our welfare system. That's clearly not true. Most people actually want to move because of jobs. That's the main reason people want to move in most cases. But still, it just appeals to the bias where people believe that outsiders only want to come to the US to exploit us, right? Another thing that you'll hear people say is that foreigners threaten our culture, right? And that's also easy to dismiss, which is, why do you think outsiders are here to ruin your culture? Why are you scared of them so much? There's really no reason to believe that. Sometimes people will say outright that they think that foreigners are lazy or that they're criminals, right? There are some very prominent politicians who will actually say that out loud. And you can say, look, that's just simply not true. To say that everybody from a certain country is lazy or criminal is frankly a form of bias. I don't buy that argument at all, and neither should you. And when you think about a lot of these arguments about open borders or restricting migration, they often rely on bizarre ideas and counterintuitive metaphors, right? So here's some things that you might commonly hear. They steal our jobs, right? Well, people don't own jobs. That's not how jobs work, right? I don't own my university position. If I failed to teach my classes, I could be dismissed and somebody else would get that job. If you run a construction business, you don't owe it to hire any particular person. Rather, you hire the person that you want to hire. Nobody else has a claim on that job. Another argument that you find that people say is, they'll say something like, a country is like a home. You need to protect it. That's a very strange counterintuitive metaphor as well. First of all, people don't own countries in the way they own homes. So for example, I don't own my fellow Americans. I don't have a slip of paper that says I own 1/330 millionth of the country. That's not how countries work. But even if that were true in some way, it doesn't follow that you can harass people who want to move to other countries. So for example, because I own my own home, doesn't mean that I can tell people not to move to other people's homes, right? We need to secure our borders. This is a very common argument. From who? The taco truck? That's my response. Most people who migrate to the United States or migrate between countries are not threatening each other. They're not threatening each other. It is not a serious problem. It's not about crime. They're not about to invade you. So securing the border is a very unusual metaphor to offer. Like, there's no security. There's no dangerous threat that's out there. Finally, when it comes to the man on the street arguments about open borders, you'll see that there's an interesting inconsistent application of the idea. And I draw this argument from a very famous speech by Martin Luther King when he was attacking segregation. He said, all these restrictions they have for African Americans, they don't apply to themselves. And that should be a really, big signal that there's something wrong with segregation. Like, if the rule is so good, you should apply it to yourself, not just to African Americans. And I think a similar logic can be applied to migration restriction, right? So for example, you have some people say we have to vet who comes in. Well, we don't do that for people inside the country. If it's so important, why don't we have a giant wall separating New York and New Jersey, where everybody from New Jersey has to file a form and pass a test and pass a history of New York test? We don't do that. People will say some of them are terrorists, so we have to crack down. We don't do that to ourselves. There are Americans, native-born Americans who commit crime, but we don't deport or harass all people born in the United States. That's frankly unfair, right? You don't blame a whole group for what a small number of people do. So this is another indication that a lot of kind of man-on-the-street arguments about open borders may be unfair, unjust, that people don't even apply to themselves. They don't apply to themselves. And then finally, this is, I think, a very important point about the kind of introductory or beginner's level open border argument, is that restrictionism actually directly harms people. So not only are restrictionist arguments counterintuitive or strange on their own right, restrictionism has direct negative consequences on people that you cannot ignore. For example, if you take a refugee from a violent country and you send them back, they could die. This is a very common thing that happens in the world. We send people back to a war zone, you're increasing the chance they will die. Another issue is that if somebody has a job offer in another country where they're going to get paid more, or they could live a better lifestyle, you're literally depriving them of thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars of income. You're directly harming them. If somebody is on the wrong side of migration law, they can be deported. And there are a lot of families that are split up. And you also violate the rights of natives. Right? There are people who would enjoy hiring somebody from another country. They may want to marry somebody, or they may want to hang out and be the friends of somebody from another country. So not only are a lot of these beginner arguments just counterintuitive, it's really on the shoulders of the restrictionists to say, I'm going to send people back to a violent country. That is justified. I'm going to deprive people of jobs. That is justified. I'm going to split up families, that's justified, and I'm going to violate the rights of natives to hire people they want to hire or to associate with, and that's justified. So you're going to need a pretty strong piece of evidence to persuade me that not only is restrictionism counterintuitive, like, you know, the arguments about stealing jobs don't make a lot of sense, but at the same time, they seem to create a lot of harm. You have to persuade me that there's some sort of counteracting positive benefit of excluding these people that would cancel out all these negative benefits. So just to summarize, the kind of beginner's level of the open borders position is that restrictionism is often based on implicit or explicit anti-foreigner bias, or in some cases just plain out racism. It relies on metaphors or ideas that don't make any sense upon further reflection. And it's also a bunch of policies people don't even apply to themselves. And then finally, the policy literally kills people. So you need to give me a strong piece of argument. You need to give me some very strong evidence to say that a policy that is counterintuitive, doesn't make a lot of sense, and has a lot of negative consequences is actually a good thing. There's some other benefit that I haven't seen or appreciated. That's what you need to offer me in order for me to change my mind about migration. And that brings me up to the intermediate level of open borders. So here's the deal. Most of you who are listening in today, you're advanced undergraduates or graduate students, or maybe some faculty members, and you say, well, Fabio, I don't believe all these lame arguments I hear on Twitter. You know, I'm better than that. I demand better evidence. Well, and it is true. There are some very seriously learned and scholarly people who are skeptical about migration or who are worried about open migration, and they offer stronger arguments. And what I'm going to try to answer back to them, or to say to them, is that those arguments are maybe not as strong as you think. They're not as strong as you think. So what are these more academic arguments that you might encounter? Well, the basic thrust of a lot of anti-immigration arguments is that they're bad overall for the country. So it's a form of utilitarian argument. So for example, people will say, well, you'll decrease the number of jobs, or you'll decrease wages within a country if you let too many migrants in. Sometimes these utilitarian arguments are about the country that sends people. So for example, there are brain drain arguments. And a brain drain argument says basically the country that sends a lot of immigrants is damaged because they're sending away the most productive people to live in another country, and that's bad for the country that sends immigrants. Once in a while, you'll get somebody who offers kind of a mercantilist view of the world, and they say, you know, nations are competing against each other, therefore we need to restrict our borders or to police our borders because there's some sort of international conflict or international competition. And how do you respond to these people? What do you say to all these arguments that say, look, there are all these negative consequences of open borders and mass migration? Well, it's the same argument that applies to free trade in general. You know, by restricting people or restricting the movement of people, we cut off opportunities for making ourselves better, having more people around, more customers, more workers, more innovation. And we also damage the immigrants who are losing opportunities, right? So this is the basic argument where people say there are all these negative effects. And the argument is like, well, you know, we don't believe that for trade of goods. You know, we don't, you know, say, you know, Korean TVs will compete with American TVs, therefore we're not going to have Korean TVs. We say, no, there's benefits to trade. The same thing with labor and movement. You know, there are benefits to letting people in. They usually, the benefits outweigh the negatives, and it really helps the immigrants. And that's the general thrust of the counter argument. So let's talk about some of these kind of particular policy issues in a little bit of detail. So for example, there is an academic literature that says something like, look, labor is not exempt from the laws of supply and demand. If you let a lot of people in, that's going to decrease wages, and you're going to put people out of work. Probably the most notable critic who offers this argument is George Borjas. He's actually a very accomplished and a very smart economist at Harvard University. And you know, he wrote a very famous paper where he claims that data from the Mariel boat lift, where there was an unexpected wave of migrants from Cuba into Florida, right, is evidence that that migration is really bad for people. And what's the response? Well, here you have to get into the nitty-gritty of the literature. So first, there's a basic empirical point, which is that his study is actually the exception. Most studies of migration that look at things like the Mariel boat lift and other examples of mass migration tend to find there isn't much of an impact. And theoretically, if you're an economist, you may be scratching your head and say, hold on, does that make sense that you have an increase in the supply of labor and the price doesn't go down? Well, there's a lot of interesting things, reasons why that's not exactly the entire story. And the basic point of it is that migrants usually go for the worst jobs. They don't go for the best jobs. So really, they're not competing with most natives. They tend to do jobs that natives don't really want to do very much. And even in Borjas's study of the Mariel boat lift data, if you actually sit down and read it very carefully, what he discovers is that the sudden influx of Cuban refugees into Florida did not change wages for most people. The one exception that he finds is that for people who have a high school degree or less, there's a small negative effect on wages. Now, when George Borjas is publicizing this result, he focuses on the second part. He focuses on the decrease of wages for high school workers and less. He doesn't talk about the fact that for most people, there's not much of a change. There's also literature that disputes Borjas, like Michael Clemens. The Economist has disputed this. But even if you believe Borjas's original analysis, you just have to say, after reading your paper, I'm persuaded there's not much of an effect. And even for people with a high school degree or less, the effect is relatively small. In 1980 dollars, the effect of wages was about $800 per year. So that's something that's clearly not trivial. In 2020 dollars, that might be $1,000 or $2,000. But that's not enough of a negative effect to make me say, I want to send people back to Cuba, right? Or I want to send them back to a communist dictatorship or an area of war. So in other words, when you actually look at the broader empirical literature, you see that the effects are not as big as the critics make them out to be. And even when the effects are there, they're not that large. And it's not enough to make me say, yes, you know, for the price of a TV, I'm going to send people back to Cuba. So what's the underlying point about jobs and migration? There are a couple. Is that migrants consume goods and they pay for services. So that's different than a TV set. So when a TV set comes in, they drive down the price of other TV sets. But when an immigrant comes in, there's a downward pressure for wages, but they're also buying stuff too. So that kind of cancels that out. And they also rarely directly compete with natives. Another argument that people have, they'll say things like, what about crime? isn't it true that immigrants bring a lot of crime with them? And once again, this can be empirically tested. And theoretically, there's a good reason to believe that immigrants do not bring in crime because of selection effects. So in other words, in order for somebody to immigrate from a country like Cuba or Mexico or Colombia to the United States, they have to learn a new language, they have to get money together, they have to learn how to move. And this selects out for people who have their act together. They're less likely to be dangerous people. And that's generally borne out in most studies. For example, Alex Naraste and Michelangelo Landgrave in a working paper, recent working paper that's about a year old, using American Community Survey data, they find that the rate of incarceration, for example, for natives is higher for immigrants, even undocumented immigrants. So even people you might think might have a higher rate of incarceration do not have it as high a rate as natives, right? The image that I'm showing here comes from Context magazine, and this is another interesting way to think about the relationship between migration and crime. The issue here is that if you look at different neighborhoods of Chicago, you discover that immigration is not correlated with crime, right? So what he did is he looked at different neighborhoods of Chicago, he classified them as high and low income, right? And he discovered that in low income neighborhoods where most of the crime is, there's not much of a difference in terms of crime and the immigration rate. Another argument that's kind of utilitarian that people offer for restricted migration is cultural. They'll say things like America has a great culture or Western European has a great culture. If people come in, they're going to vote for bad policies, they'll have bad cultural ideas. And there's a couple of intuitive responses to that kind of argument. First is just to shrug our shoulders and say, so what? Natives have bad policies, but we don't deport them. And if you're a classical liberal, you probably believe that a lot of policies that are pursued today are bad, but we don't deport or harass people for having poorly thought out policy ideas. But then there's also an empirical point, which is that if you look at immigrants in the US and also in a lot of other places, but mainly in the US, you discover that they resemble the average Democrat in terms of their policy preferences. Like they're slightly left to center, but not very much. We can get into the nitty gritty of that, but the overall point is they don't seem to really be bringing radically different ideas. They tend to be like other American natives. And then there's a third point about assimilation, which is that after about one generation, most people tend to assimilate into the culture of where they moved. And we can see that in various ways. So for example, if you look at studies of migrants from Spanish-speaking countries, like 90% of their children speak English, and a very large proportion of the first generation, they learn English as well. Second generation people or third generation, almost none of them speak the language of the home country. They seem to assimilate very well. I have a picture here of one of my favorite towns in the US, that's Dearborn, Michigan. And in Dearborn, Michigan, they have this huge Arab American population. And I love talking about Dearborn, Michigan, because on paper, you'd think it would be a very contentious place. There are people from all parts of the world, including parts of the world where there's civil war. There's a section of Dearborn where they have Yemeni people and people from Iraq. Yet they don't fight. What they do is actually open up nice coffee shops. So if you have a liberal, open, tolerant society, most people tend to assimilate pretty well. And then finally, before kind of getting to some bigger points, I want to address this brain drain point. And so the argument is, look, immigration is bad because the country that sends people out is losing valuable resources. And the answer is that's a very incomplete picture. First of all, there's a lot of spillover effects where people will move to a new country and they'll send money back home. And that's a very common thing. People send money back and forth. So actually, the country that sends immigrants often benefits because often those are poor countries, their economies aren't working very well, there may be a lot of corruption, and people's lives can improve when their children or relatives send them money. And then another thing that's important about immigration and brain drain is that people go to other countries often come back. So they may work for 5, 10, 20 years, and then they retire, they have a retirement account, and they come back to the home country, and they bring their skills with them, and they improve the country that way. So in response to this brain drain argument, I say, look, it's actually more like a brain loan than a brain drain, right? So it's really false to believe that there's a one-way trip Rather, you go out, money comes back immediately, and then later a lot of people come back, and the home country benefits from that, in addition to the country that hosts the immigrant. I want to take a minute also to talk about this battle analogy. Sometimes you'll see some critics of migration, they'll say things like, nations are in a competition with each other. It's a battle between different countries. This is the old mercantilist argument. But in the age of Trump, we've seen a little bit of a revival of that argument, this idea that countries are in a battle with each other. And they see migration restrictions as some form of competition between countries. And my argument is pretty straightforward, is like, actually, no, that you're depriving yourself of a lot of benefits by restricting migrants. And there's a recent paper, not recent anymore, it's about 10 years old now, by Michael Clemens, where he estimates the economic losses from migration. And the answer is trillions of dollars. So in other words, imagine an entire Western Europe or an entire United States worth of money and wealth appearing. That's what you're cutting off when you restrict migration. And that certainly cannot help your country. It's actually hurting your country. Now, I want to kind of switch a little bit into kind of a normative argument rather than an empirical social argument. You can say, well, Fabio, all these points about, about jobs, about crime, about culture, about lost income, about national competition, these are all utilitarian arguments on some level. But isn't there some deontological or some sort of, more broadly based argument against open borders? Well, here's my response. Name an ethical theory that would justify imposing death, family separation, and poverty on hundreds of millions of people who've not committed a crime against you. I don't think there's any theory that would say that. They'll say it is completely justified to put up these restrictions with these huge negative consequences against people who have not done anything against you. So kind of on a utilitarian basis, I think restriction of migration is not a good idea. Also in terms of ethics, it is also a very dubious thing. Like, what kind of ethical theory would support this kind of regime? And when I think about ethics and open borders, I actually tend to think of open borders as a common ground position. So in America today, we often think of positions being Democrat or Republican, and if you pick one side, you got to be against the other side. If my guy takes this position, then that means I have to oppose it. And actually, I have the opposite opinion about this specific issue. This is not a zero-sum issue where if you're on one side of the political debate, you're automatically on the other side. Instead, I think that open borders is a common ground position. That if you really think about the ethical motivations or the key insights of different intellectual traditions, you see that most of them point towards the position of open borders, right? So you don't have to get into an argument with people who are different than you. You can just say, look, just reflect on your own ethical position and think about why you would want to restrict migration. So for example, if you're a libertarian, I think freedom of movement is obvious. The presumption of libertarianism and libertarian theory and classical liberalism is that states should, be laissez-faire. Like we should only restrict something or interfere if there's a very good reason for it. If you're politically liberal, right, you're like a Rawlsian, right? You really think and that the power of government is to be used to help the worst people off, the people who are worst off in the world. Then migration is a great tool, because one of the easiest ways to relieve global poverty is to allow people to move to wealthier countries. And we see that over and over throughout history, that it's easier to let people migrate to a wealthier country than to reform a country that's not working, right? So if you're a Rawlsian, you're the kind of person who really believes in helping the little guy, immigration is a great tool. And it's a relatively easy and low cost tool as well. What if you're politically conservative, right? What if you believe in self-reliance, right? And traditional family values? Then open borders and free migration is very consistent with conservatism. Immigration is a way to let people pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It is not a form of welfare, it's a form of justice. You just say, well, if you really want to, not live on a poverty wage, why don't you compete for a job in a country that's industrialized and that's working relatively well, right? And if you're a social conservative, then splitting up families should be something that appalls you, right? Any policy that ends up in a situation where children come home from school and they discover their parents have been deported is a horrible policy. Like, how can that support family values, right? So you're a Marxist. Let's say that you're on the left and you really believe in global revolution, and you believe that capitalists are exploiting laborers, then I would say open borders is for you, because you should let people move so they can have social solidarity, so they can pursue social change. If you think something is unjust or unfair in some place, foot voting is a great way to address that problem. It's imperfect, but it is a tool, and you should let people band together, right? Create that kind of class consciousness. So my point here is not to say that everybody should agree on every topic. Rather, instead, it's a different argument. The argument is that open borders really is consistent with a lot of different ethical perspectives. You don't need to adopt a new philosophy or a new perspective in order to appreciate an open borders position. So I want to spend the last maybe 5 or 10 minutes talking a little bit about the expert level of open borders. As you can imagine, I am very strongly in favor of open borders. I really believe that open borders is what really, most people should believe. I don't think it's a policy issue that's terribly complicated. The empirical evidence, most of it shows that migration is either not an issue or has very small negative effects. It also has a lot of great positive effects. It's also consistent with multiple ethical orientations. So you don't have to say, I have to quit being a conservative in order to believe in open borders. Rather, if you are truly conservative, you should believe in open borders, right? So then what is the bigger issue, right? If you buy my arguments, what is the next kind of big thing that you should think about? The answer is social change. How should you actually pursue or think about open borders? Because one counter argument that people will offer, they'll say things like, it's a nice idea in theory, but it's really unpopular. What's the point in pursuing unpopular ideas? And that's the expert level of open borders, thinking about the very long process by which we persuade other people in our community or our society that a certain policy is bad, is counterproductive, and we should move towards a different position, right? So the first thing to do is to remember to go back in time and think about all the massive forms of social injustice that we've had in our lifetimes or in recent history. And in every single case, people said, this will never change. This will never change. For example, people said slavery is natural. It will never change. That's wrong. Slavery is wrong. It is not natural. It can be changed. People said the same thing about apartheid and segregation in the United States. They would say things like, this is the natural order of things. They say, no, it's actually not. It is actually not the natural order of things. Racial segregation is bad, and I can imagine a world without it. And you may think this is ancient history, but my father's generation lived in a segregated world. They lived in a world where whites and blacks could not drink from the same water fountain, right? They went to different schools. And thankfully, people said, no, that is not normal. We can move on from that. Communism, right? How many people in 1950 or 1960 would have thought the Soviet system would come to an end? But it did, because people could imagine it, right? Gay rights, right? Who knew in 1950 or 1960 that sexual minorities would have more recognition today than they ever imagined possible? Like we'd have gay marriage, the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and a larger general acceptance of LGBT people, right? Women's rights are the same way. People say, no, it's natural that one gender represses another. The answer is no, that's not natural, right? So the first thing to do is to realize that there's a lot of large global change. It may not happen in your lifetime, but it can happen. And if it will happen in the future, it starts today, right? So what's the kind of three-pronged strategy? What is the idea? So I have this kind of idea that there are different ways of approaching open borders. One is outreach. So like today's today's discussion is one example of that. Maybe some of you already like open borders. Maybe some of you have never heard of it. But just by talking about it, you normalize it, move the needle a little bit. There's politics. So if there's a politician who says nice things about open borders, you should say, good for you. That's great, right? And when they don't say something nice about immigration, you write them a letter or give them a phone call and say, don't do that. You can also advocate policies like DACA and the DREAM Act that move things in the right direction. There's also an argument for direct action. So some people may say, what's the role for activism? It's like, well, there's always a role for activism. For example, there are people who try to shelter immigrants to try to prevent them from getting deported. There's something called the sanctuary movement. That's when people kind of harbor immigrants in their homes or their churches so that the police don't pick them up and deport them. There's also sanctuary at kind of a legal level where you can persuade local city councils and mayors to pass laws saying that we're not going to enforce migration restrictions. If you're arrested in our town, we're not going to hand you over to the authorities for deportation. And will any of these single actions magically result in a world of free migration? The answer is not immediately, but little by little, the system is chipped away. Already, in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a little bit of liberalization in attitudes towards immigrants. People are now questioning the system. The Supreme Court recently supported the DACA program, which President Obama started. Imperfect, but I think it's definitely a move in the right direction. And all these things, little by little, set the stage for further social change. So, so I want to end this talk in kind of a moral point, which is that if you're an open borders person, or you would think about it, you're kind of like an abolitionist, right? Being an open borders person today in a world of deportations and ICE raids and detention centers, it's like being an abolitionist in the 1800s or civil rights activist in the 1940s or 50s. People think you're crazy. People think your ideas are kind of off the rocker, that they're really weird, but you have reason on your side. And the reason is pretty simple, which is movement is okay. Movement should be legal. All your concerns can be addressed about migration, and there are relatively few negative consequences. That's a very strong foundation to stand on, right? And so as you talk to people about open borders and think through these ideas, you should draw strength from this fact that you're on the right side of things. You have reason and logic on your side. So that's the first step towards social change. You require an internal change before you can kind of generate external change. So I just want to finish up by saying, once again, thank you to the IHS staff for sponsoring this talk. Thank you to all of you who are spending part of your summer vacation doing this seminar rather than going surfing or going kite flying or whatever you like to do during the summer. And to any donors who made this possible, because it really does take a village to have a seminar like this. So I want to thank everybody, and I look forward to your Q&A. And now I will hand it over to Jason, if Jason is ready, to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Professor Rojas. So we have several questions that have come in, and we will just jump right in. And if you have additional questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. We will probably have more questions than we have time to get to, but we will try to get to as many as we can. So first, one student asks, what do you think the strongest argument of those that you've presented is against open borders? And which one is the strongest? And briefly, how would you summarize your response?
Right. So for example, probably the one that I think is the strongest is that you might not like the values that some immigrants bring in. I think this is a little bit overblown. So for example, sometimes people who make this argument, they have this image that, the most fundamentalist radical people will take over America if they move from some other part of the world. I don't believe that, but there can be change that you might not like. So for example, if you have a lot of immigrants from, say, a social democratic country, like say Sweden, then you might see a change towards a more social democratic direction. What's my response to that? My response to that is, hey, look at the magnitude of the change and really ask, should I really restrict those people? So for example, as a classical liberal, I might not approve of all the policies that come in from, say, a social democratic nation like Sweden. But on the other hand, that's not so bad. Like if somebody sets up a mini Sweden in Minnesota, it's not that bad, right? Or if somebody sets up a slightly more socially conservative section of town, that's really not that bad. And it certainly doesn't outweigh saving people from poverty or discrimination or violence in other countries. So I think that's the thing to say, like, okay, it's true, there is cultural change that immigrants bring. That's a thing, I can give you examples, but I would not deport those people back to their country and make their lives miserable just because I happen to disagree with some of their politics. That strikes me as fundamentally illiberal.
So relatedly, Nozick argues, according to the question, that individuals should be able to self-organize into communities of their own choosing. should this type of argument cause problems for your open borders argument? That is, shouldn't groups within a country or region be at liberty to exclude others?
Yeah, so here's the issue, which is what kind of a group are we talking about, right? What kind of a group are we talking about? So for example, if somebody says, I'm going to get all the people in my town to vote in a certain city council member or city council, and they're going to pass rules saying that Mexicans can't come to my town, I'll say that's really bad because, you know, the purpose of government is to maintain services that are open to people and not to punish people just because they're from Mexico, right? Or from whatever country we're talking about. But say, for example, you have a private church or a private club. They can invite whoever they want, right? So I think there's a very famous church called the Westboro Baptist Church, and they're notoriously illiberal. Like they really don't like any kind of ethnic minorities. You know, if I showed up at their door, they would almost certainly slam the door shut and tell me to get lost. But the point is they own the property. They're not engaged in a public issue like, you know, schooling or education or something like that, or running a hospital or something like that. So if you want to have a private church where you want to keep out people you hate, you know, that you can do that today, and you can certainly do that. But open borders is really about using the power of states in order to keep out people from certain countries. And I think that's an important distinction.
Can you talk a little bit more about keyhole solutions? So what are they, and where would you draw the line on which keyhole solutions are acceptable?
Yeah, so a keyhole solution, just to review, is a solution, a policy proposal or policy design that's aimed to fix one problem. So if you say, Fabio, I kind of agree on all these issues, but the one thing that I hung up on is this issue, then let's come up with a solution to fix that, rather than just excluding people overall. Here's my favorite example from immigration, and this isn't even international immigration. There isn't a genuine issue in public school funding. So if you grew up in Minnesota, and then you go to the University of Wisconsin, you may get a cheap education, but you never paid taxes, right? And so I think there's a very reasonable keyhole solution, which is just to say, look, you have to be a resident for a few years and pay a few years of taxes before you get a tax break or a discount on schooling. And I don't see why similar solutions cannot be applied to migration, right? So to say, okay, you know, maybe you pay a couple extra % in tax, or, you know, you're not allowed to obtain a certain service, or you have to pay a full price or something, not to make it punitive or exclusionary, but just to say, look, you know, if you're really worried about this issue, there's a much more humane way to deal with it than to exclude people. Like imagine what if we said, okay, some people from Minnesota want to go to school at the University of Wisconsin, but they haven't paid taxes. Therefore, we're going to make a Berlin-style wall between Minnesota and Wisconsin. You would say, that's crazy, that's nuts. There's a much easier solution. So there are all kinds of solutions that, you know, that are already out there, right? That are already out there that we should consider. And they're so much more humane. It's so much more humane to say, look, just pay your taxes for a few years and you can get a public school discount, rather than say, we're banning you from Wisconsin for life, right? So that's the idea behind the keyhole solution.
As a sociologist, why do you think that people are so resistant to open borders?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think the answer is pretty intuitive, which is, you know, part of humanity, just kind of, I don't know if it's an evolutionary thing or a thing that we've learned over time, but basically people are scared of outsiders. You know, there's a real fear of outsiders. You know, if you've ever driven through a neighborhood with people from a different country, you may feel a little bit out of place, right? So that's that basic instinct, like, I don't know if I belong here. I feel weird. I feel like I'm an outsider. That's a basic element of humanity. And in its worst manifestation, it manifests itself as racism or gender discrimination or xenophobia, discrimination against immigrants. And I think that's the basic idea, which is people really are scared, you know, and it's kind of a very basic thing that humans have evolved, which is to say people on the outside of the group may be a threat to me. It's not a crazy idea. I don't think people are silly or ridiculous for having that feeling or emotion. But then the next thing to step back and say, okay, I recognize I feel that emotion. What can I do to see whether that's justified, right? Because there are lots of things that we feel an emotion about, which you just kind of have to just come to grips with and realize it's not a rational emotion.
So we've got a couple of questions about nationalism.
Sure.
So the abolition of slavery, serfdom, and segregation, and so on, were all compatible with nationalism. Can open borders be compatible with nationalism, or do we need to get rid of it entirely to reach the sort of open borders that you're suggesting?
Well, it may be surprising or not so surprising, but I am not a nationalist. I think America is an amazing country. I do actually think America is a wonderful country, one of the coolest places ever invented. But still, it has its flaws and its imperfections. And because I think America is a great place, doesn't mean that I get to exclude people from other countries. But the basic issue about, is open borders compatible with nationalism? You have to ask what version of nationalism, right? So if you're saying I'm in it for my pride, right? My pride, my civic identity, then sure, absolutely. For example, like there's an open border between New Jersey and New York, but there's still New York pride. People love New York. It's a great place. I love New York City. I love going there. And you can tell that people who've lived there a long time love it too. Like New York is fabulous. It's a great place. But that doesn't mean they can't let in people from New Jersey, right? Or Connecticut, right? Like people, a love of New York is not incompatible with letting people move in and out, right? It's also counterintuitive on some level, which is if your country is so great, why do you keep people away from it, right? Now, there's a more sophisticated argument where you may say, well, maybe countries are in some sort of competition against each other. And I would argue, well, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Don't you want the best and most motivated people? Those tend to be immigrants. They bring a lot of wealth with them. They bring a lot of skills with them. They bring a lot of ideas. And so one argument I often offer conservatives is like, if you're really about national security, and that's like something that really drives a lot of conservative thought, then don't you want the smartest people on your side? Like, don't you want the world's best to come to your country and try to show that they belong by, honoring the country and its traditions? So, let people come. And of course, if your version of nationalism is essentially xenophobia in disguise, like people of a certain blood or heritage are allowed here and not others, right? That kind of idea I find very illiberal, and I would just question it on its basis. And I would say, look, that kind of xenophobic nationalism is inconsistent with open borders, and thank God it is, because I don't want to be associated with a nationalism that's predicated on seeing the rest of the world as racially inferior. That's just a wrong attitude.
On the subject of national security, is there anything to be said for temporary immigration restrictions for national security purposes?
Yeah, and so, in general, you could probably guess I'm pretty skeptical, and I would take it on a case-by-case basis. And, it's the more that I think about individual cases in terms of national security, the less I am persuaded by them, right? So in theory, you could come up with a hypothetical example where, like there's somebody's carrying a nuclear bomb in a suitcase and you don't know which person on the border it is, so you have to shut down the border. Like, sure, I could come up with philosophy seminar examples of national security threats, and I would say, fine, if that's actually what's happening, I'm more than happy to compromise because nobody wants a nuclear bomb on their doorstep. But what's the actual reality? Like empirically, when you actually look at most migration situations, how is security improved by restricting people? Well, first of all, you criminalize a lot of people who are trying to get in, right? So you tell all people from Syria that because 5 people from Syria are terrorists, that the rest of them are. So that's like a very criminalizing bad message. Another important point is that if you're spending all this time and effort checking every single Syrian, stopping out the border, creating refugee camps, that's a lot of money you're not spending looking for the actual terrorists, right? So if you're really worried about a particular national security threat, it's way easier to actually focus on the people you're interested about rather than getting an entire blanket policy that excludes all these people, and you're not actually catching, you're not actually catching the people who are doing it. And then finally, the law-abiding people aren't, they're going to be the ones who wait patiently in a refugee camp. The people who are really bad are the ones who are going to try to get around that, right? So, in theory, like I said, in a philosophy class, or maybe in some weird case, I could see an exemption for national security that I would be very open to. But in the real world, like, I just don't understand how creating a Syrian refugee camp is going to help you catch those 20 people who are a real threat.
And speaking of refugees, open borders means safe, legal, and common migration. How should we address the EU's migration crisis where it is not safe or legal?
Right. And so that gets to the social change question, which is a lot of the danger with migration has to do with restrictions, right? So for example, how many people die on the way from New Jersey to New York? Very few. Like, aside from naturally occurring auto accidents, almost nobody gets harmed. Similarly, before we put up a strict border between Mexico and the US, nobody ever heard of Mexican migrants dying in the desert. Like, unless they got lost on a trail or something, that just never happened. Like, it just wasn't an issue. Because normally, if you need to migrate to, say, pick lettuce in California or do agricultural work, you just buy a bus ticket. That's completely safe, right? And so a lot of these problems in the EU, like, people, refugees moving from Syria to Turkey, and then Turkey into Eastern Europe, moving up through Hungary, a lot of those issues have to do with the fact that it's illegal or difficult to do it to begin with. If you just said, look, we're just going to leave you alone. You can buy a bus ticket. You guys have your own money. A lot of Syrian refugees, talking about the EU case, they're often middle-class people. They're not super wealthy, but they can afford a bus ticket. You just say, buy a bus ticket to a town where you think you can find a job. That's an extremely safe process. It only becomes unsafe when you say, no, no, no. Yes, I understand you're starving. Yes, I understand that the Syrian government is trying to kill you, but please wait here for 2 years. Then people will get desperate, and that's where you create a lot of problems. So first, legalize it. And then also, the thing about the EU is, there's a lot of variation in opinion. There's a lot of nationalists in the EU. And what I would recommend is we have to target them, or target moderate voters, and get them to kind of back off from supporting nationalists. And I think those two things together will start making things a lot more safe in the EU in terms of migration.
What do you make of the concept of immigration shocks? And is this something that we should distinguish from immigration flows?
Yeah, and so that's a really great question. So maybe if other listeners don't understand an immigrant shock, usually, the idea is that there's a very large surge, right? An unexpected surge that, we weren't expecting. And that's different than the common flow back and forth. So let me give you a really concrete example. A normal immigration flow between Mexico and the US has to do with agriculture. Every spring, the fields are planted in California. People move up from Mexico to pick the fruit and pick the vegetables. They make money and they bring it back home. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And before we set up border restrictions in the US, this was completely normal. Like, this even goes back to Native American times. People just moving up and down California and Mexico, looking for work and looking for where the economy is good. In contrast, the Mariel boat lift in 1980, and for you listeners who don't know about this, that was when Fidel Castro literally went to the jails, picked up about 80,000 people. Maybe that's a little high, maybe it's lower than that, but it's tens of thousands of people, and just literally ejected them into Miami. And just said, you deal with it. Here's the problem. That's more of a shock, right? And so what I can say is, first of all, shocks are relatively uncommon, right? So just as an empirical thing, they're like hurricanes. Like, you don't know exactly when they're coming. They do happen from time to time, but it's not an issue that most people should worry about. And then number two, empirically, it turns out it's not that bad. Like, people complain about the sudden surge of immigrants, but like a generation later, they're assimilated. And as David Card's research on the Mariel boat lift shows, that even in terms of short-term labor markets, they don't seem to have that much of an effect, because the refugees often have to survive by doing the worst jobs first before they can move up. So you don't see that much of a change in the labor market.
Here's an interesting question. Could it be rational to be scared of outsiders when you see what uncontrolled immigration did to Native Americans?
Right. And so here, I like to make the distinction between warfare and immigration, right? And so this is actually a very, very crucial point, which is to say, why are you immigrating? 99% of modern times, it's because people want a job. What's happening when a Mexican moves to California is they just want to work. That's all they want, right? However, there are periods when obviously some countries are in a conquest of other countries, right? And so what I would say is that that is not migration in the normal sense, that's conquest. And what I tell people is that if you're at the border and you see a tank, you should be worried. But if you go to the border and you see a taco truck, you should smile. That's the difference.
It's a good policy.
Yeah.
Is there a case for subsidizing immigration or otherwise offering government aid?
I'm very classically liberal, so I'm very skeptical of, subsidies and supports and quotas. But I don't think they're the worst thing in the world. I'm not going to lie to you. If your city wants to support Mexican migrants by, giving them housing vouchers or something like that, I don't think that's that bad. If the city government really wants to do that, or if the national government wants to do that, there's lots of kinds of humanitarian programs where we give free food, free clothing, free education to migrants. And I would just say that on one side, you can say, well, is that a case of government intervention? The answer is yes, but it's not that bad in the big scheme of things, right? Like, that's just not something I worry about. What I really worry about is when we take the immigrants and separate them and tell them you can't move here, you have to stay in a refugee camp, there's a 10-year waiting list. But if they move here, they take advantage of the resources and they're paying their taxes. I don't worry about it. If the city government wants to give you a little bit of extra, that's fine. That doesn't really shock me, in the same way as if the city government had some other group they wanted to help out, like the homeless or people who needed sheltering for whatever reason. I don't think it's really something I worry about, even though technically you can get to a libertarian argument about whether that's justified or not. I just honestly don't worry about it. It's fine with me.
All right, we have time for one last question.
Sure.
Should there be open borders during pandemics?
Yes, long as you migrate safely, right? So the interesting thing about pandemics is that they create a public goods problem. They create a negative externality. The problem with pandemic isn't that you're sick. That's not the problem. The problem is you can make somebody else sick. So that's different than cancer. Like when you have cancer, you just get sick. But when you have a disease like COVID, you could actually make somebody else really sick. So then the answer is, how do we normally deal with negative externalities in the rest of life? We don't shut down society. We don't shut down trade. We just say, you got to do it, but you can do it safely, right? So for example, if somebody's like, I'm just driving my car by myself between Mexico and the US, I'd be like, fine, that's not a problem. If you're cramming 80 people on a bus, I would say, okay, well, I'd have to think about the policy, but that's a reason to be suspicious. But why not ask them just to drive a car or to take an airplane that's not crowded? So you have to pay more to buy extra space on an airplane, right? So in other words, when pandemics break out, we actually learn about how they spread. We understand how to control COVID. You wear a mask, and I do ask all of you to wear a mask when you go into a crowded place, avoid crowded places. But if you can move to a new home while keeping other people safe, I don't see the problem with that.